So, with all this going on, one of the really important things that I have talked about with the U.S. Russian relationship in probably the past month, probably the biggest bright spot I said was CIA Director William Burns traveling to Russia. Now, the hope was that Burns, who was a statesman, somebody that, even Ray McGovern has said, seems to really understand the U.S. Russian relationship, famously, wrote the net means net memo, kind of saying that Russia has a serious red line about Ukraine joining NATO. And somebody understanding Russian red lines and actually talking to the Russians is probably a good thing, rather than, having somebody like Victoria Nuland go to Russia as Joe Biden did, who actually orchestrated the 2014 coup in Ukraine, or was heavily, heavily involved in that, as is known because the phone call where she is plotting the coup has been released and is available for anybody to listen to in public. Just search in Google F the EU. All right, so yeah, hoping that Burns goes, he's the statement. He says we had to get this in line. And what does he go over there to do? He warns Russia that there will be consequences if they are behind the recent Havana Syndrome attacks, which, is something I've talked about on this show very, very frequently. That, I'm very skeptical that Havana Syndrome exists whatsoever. I think it's largely a psychosomatic, thing, plus cases generated by the U.S. government, essentially warning everyone, if you have a headache, if you feel like you're not as sharp as you used to be, did a lot of drinking last night, you have a pretty severe hangover. Might not be a hangover. It might be that the Russians are shooting some kind of microwave gun at your head, and that's causing you to, go crazy and have brain damage. While they can't actually prove that this exists, and a lot of science has, really shown that this is unlikely to be true. Scott Horn did a good interview, and I forget this woman's name, but one of the things that she explains is there's no external symptoms whatsoever, and they allege that this is a microwave gun, which you would see external symptoms on the skin if people are being had their head blasted with microwaves. Of course, originally they claimed that this was a sonic weapon, and it turned out when they recorded it, it was just crickets and not a sonic weapon. So, you got Burns traveling to Russia and threatening them over this fake thing. And it suggests to me that he is not quite the statesman that I had hoped. That he probably wouldn't fly to Russia and threaten them over this if he could really look at the evidence here. Just a couple more things on Havana real quick, though, that I think are important, is that the FBI is essentially acknowledging that Havana syndrome is real, even though they really can't identify what it is, and that they are going to get agents who suffer from it with access to medical care. So this is certainly going to ramp up the number of psychosomatic cases if you're starting to offer free healthcare for it, as well as the FBI warning its staff about Havana syndrome. So basically saying, hey, anytime you got a headache, send your boss an email, because it may be Russian secret brainwaves, not, you did too much drinking last night. And also the FBI is saying that Havana syndrome is a top priority of theirs. I guess the only positive thing I could absolutely think about this is the FBI investigating something fake may be less damaging than the FBI investigating other things, but it seems like they're going to churn up an awful lot of anti-Russian propaganda with these investigations. Last thing real quick on the whole Russia issue, and that is the Poland-Belarus border crisis seems to have been clipped down a couple more notches over the past week, as another 570 migrants were flown out of Belarus and back to Iraq. The plane landed in Erbil, kind of confirming some of the things I have been talking about on the show over the past couple weeks, believing that most of the people that were at the border with Belarus were Iraqi Kurds, having a lot of interesting I don't know, bad story there, right? Where, the Iraqi Kurds were some of the, preferred Iraqis for the Americans over the past 20 years. And yet you have massive numbers of them fleeing and, at least allowing for a border crisis to be manufactured in Belarus. Now, I say manufactured not because I necessarily am 100% targeting the Belarusian government and Lukashenko, although I don't think that that government did anything to stop and maybe incentivize this to happen somewhat. But to talk about the mainstream media some here for weeks and weeks and weeks is constantly talking about this border crisis, on the situation with Belarus and drumming up war propaganda with Russia, talking about this is equivalent to terrorism and all this insane rhetoric that almost belongs like in a, Republican Party anti George Soros ad, is essentially what they're accusing Putin and Lukashenko of being here. And to just kind of remember and put this into context, we are talking about a few thousand, 4 to 5,000. There are far more people along the U.S. southern border, and while I'm not trying to diminish the suffering that the people are going through on that border, and the fact that 10 people have died in the past couple of months is absolutely tragic. However, we did just have 27 people drowned to death in the English Channel trying to cross from France to England, which shouldn't have a border crisis at all, right? Aren't these two countries friends? And why are migrants trying to get the hell out of France to get to England is one question. But again, like, how can these two countries not work together to come up with something? And why isn't the media now 100% focused on the border crisis between France and England, because that's already far more deadly than the one between Poland and Belarus. Also, you see a lot of the same thing with migrants trying to cross Libya. All the time there are people dying trying to make that cross from Libya to Italy, and it's rarely, if ever, reported on anymore. One was like 100,000 people a year, tens of thousands of people, drowning to death. Then, yeah, they were talking about and reporting on it, but now that it's only, a few score people, a dozen people here or there, something like that, really doesn't get talked about. Although, that situation is far more serious, far more migrants, far more death than the one on Belarus and Poland.